So the first stop on our journey through the evolution of drumming and the drum set is 1865. Now, why this particular date, 1865? Well, first of all, for those of you who know your history, 1865 was the year that the American Civil War ended. And that meant that African slaves and their descendants were free and could start to participate much more in American society and contribute more to American music. And as we see as we go through this whole series, African Americans have contributed a tremendous amount to the drum set and to the way that we play it. So what else was happening in 1865? Well, for the first time, drummers were starting to experiment with putting together more than one instrument. In other words, prior to this time, you had like marching band type of a scenario, or maybe classical music. And in those instances, a drummer would maybe play a bass drum, or they'd play a snare drum, or they'd play cymbals. Well, around this time period, you had drummers in theaters and stage shows and vaudeville type scenarios. So drummers started thinking, well, how can we have one guy do the job of many? And so this is a very interesting time period, and that's why we're beginning here. So what was the most popular kind of music that was happening in America in 1865? Well, as we said earlier, it was actually marching band music, because there was no jazz, there was no rock, there was no blues to speak of. This was before all that time. So you had marching bands, and the marching feel involved rudiments, it involved bass drum, kind of on 1 and 3, right? Boom, chick, 1, 2, 3, 4. So you had kind of this boom, chick thing going on. So the drummers that were taking this idea of playing more than one instrument at once were taking this concept of marching and started playing a bass drum and a snare drum together at the same time, but without a pedal. And they developed a really interesting technique called double drumming. You'll notice that the style that I used in playing that little demonstration had what we call a 2 feel, where the bass drum comes on beats 1 and 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, boom, chick, boom, chick, boom. So it's very downbeat heavy, and it's music that's designed to help large groups of soldiers march down a field from one end to the other. So it's very simple and straightforward. And as we move more towards the next segment we're going to get into, which is ragtime music, this kind of basic march idea starts to become syncopated, starts to swing a little more, starts to dance a little more, and starts to move more towards dance music. The next stop on our journey through the evolution of the drum set is 1890. Now in 1890, there was a really interesting new kind of music that was coming up, that was kind of taking America by storm, and that music was called ragtime. Ragtime, okay? And what was cool about ragtime, it had this kind of new feel to it, this sort of syncopated feel that came from African American piano players and banjo players and guitar players. It had this cool kind of this sort of thing we call syncopation. And that made people dance, made them go crazy. They loved to dance to it. So ragtime comes up and it becomes really popular in the 1890s. And by the turn of the century into the 20th century, it becomes probably the most popular kind of music in America. So how were drummers involved with ragtime? Well, interestingly, we talked about in the previous segment that, drummers were still really in a kind of a marching scenario, playing a lot of rudiments. And remember, the drum set at this time really isn't a drum set that we had today. We didn't have ride cymbals, we didn't have crash cymbals, we didn't have big tunable tom-toms, we didn't have a lot of fancy hardware. So drummers really had very little to work with to create the rhythms that they were going to create behind ragtime. But one of the fun things that started to happen was that drummers began to improvise more. So even though you hear the sound of rudiments, now drummers are kind of getting crazy with it, and they were utilizing them all over the place and improvising with them with this cool new sense of swing. Another interesting thing that was happening around 1890 was that tons and tons of immigrants were flowing into America from all different parts of the world, many different countries, many different regions. So you had Asians coming, you had people coming from Turkey and Greece, you had people coming from Europe, and all of these different people were bringing their ethnic instruments with them. They were bringing their drum making technology, their cymbal making technology, and as a result of that, drummers that were here in America who were doing this ragtime drumming and playing these different theater shows and these new kinds of music that were happening started to borrow these ethnic immigrant instruments and add them onto the very basic drum set, which we had said basically just consisted of marching instruments, bass drum, snare drum, and a cymbal. So they started putting all that together, and you get this cool new sound and feel called ragtime. Devices, these little contraptions that the immigrant groups were bringing with them to America and that drummers were borrowing, these started to become part of the very earliest drum sets. And of course, eventually, this term contraption was shortened down to traps. So literally, drummers during the last couple decades of the 1800s and the first few decades of the 1900s, right on up to about 1930, were called trap drummers. That's actually the way we didn't call it a drum set. We call it a trap set, and they were called trap drummers. The next stop in our journey through the evolution of the drum set and drum set playing is 1909. And this date is super important for all us drummers today because it was the date that the Ludwig family patented their famous bass drum pedal design. Now, we'll get to this pedal in a second, but certainly pedals had been around for a while. I've seen a photo from 1840 that showed a very crude operated foot device, but probably by 1870, in the 1870s, it was standard for drummers to use what was called an overhang pedal. And this was a real interesting device. It was also fairly primitive in that it actually attached to the top of the bass drum and went over the top, and then this spring thing came down and had this footboard, and you'd hit the footboard, and this little beater thing that was attached to the spring would whap, go in and hit the drum. Now, the overhang pedal design was really clunky. It was hard to get control over it. It was hard to play it quickly. And if you remember, we talked about double drumming. Most drummers in the 1870s actually preferred to do double drumming without any pedal at all as a way to play multiple drums rather than use one of these overhang pedals because they were so clumsy and hard to use. So this is a Ludwig pedal. This one is actually a little bit later. This one's from 1924, but it's very similar to the earliest pedals. And what always blows me away, we think, oh gosh, 1909, that's over 100 years ago. Obviously, what we have today is so much better than what those guys came up with back then. But in reality, we're still using the exact same pedal for the most part that they were using over 100 years ago. That's how durable and well thought out this design was. And as you can see, you basically have a spring, an adjustable spring. You have kind of a classic footboard, and that just does the same deal, pulls it down. You have a way to attach it to the hoop of your bass drum and tighten it down, and indeed you even have two different adjustments there, just like you do on most modern pedals. So this guy, has been around for a long time. Now, a couple of the things that, again, we think we're so advanced today. Well, these guys had a lot of real cool advancements going on as well. One of those is that early pedals often actually had a cymbal attached to the bass drum, and they would have a little thing coming out of here. This one has an attachment for it that you can see here, a little clanger. So when you press down on the footboard, this little clanger would come up and hit the cymbal that was attached to the batter head of your bass drum. So when the bass drum hit, wham, it would get that clanging effect. The other thing you'll notice about this pedal that's a little different is this beater ball. Now, we've probably seen felt beaters before, but back in the day, they really had larger beaters And again, this is because the bass drums of the time were much larger. They were often 26, 28, 30, even sometimes up to 40 inches in diameter. So they were huge. So the beaters really still resemble a marching band bass drum beater, which is a lot, tends to be a lot puffier and thicker. And where it's wearing away, you can see it's like a lambskin under here. So this is a lamb's wool beater. The other thing that's so cool about this pedal that we don't really think about today is that your average working drummer of the time didn't have a car. Not everybody had a car in those times. So they had to use public transportation to get to their gigs, which means they had to carry the entire drum set on their back, because whatever you could fit on the streetcar was all you were allowed to carry. So this pedal is very, very cool because we can do this. Take that out, take this out, pull this out, and now your pedal's broken down, and you could just tuck it in your overcoat pocket, take it to work. So there you go, the bass drum pedal. Pretty cool. I'm holding in my hand something that probably most of you out there are very familiar with. These are a set of brushes, of course. And brushes are a real interesting story, and that's our next stop on our journey through the evolution of the drum set. The date is 1912. And 1912 is a year that, believe it or not, we could find patents for fly swatters that had been registered. Okay, now you're thinking fly swatters, what does that have to do with drumming? Well, interestingly, the need for brushes arose because drummers were having a lot of problems with always playing so loud and overshadowing the other instruments. You have to remember, in this early part of the 20th century, we didn't have big PA systems, we didn't have amplified guitars, didn't have mics to put on things, but drums were already the same sizes that we have today. In fact, the bass drums tended to be even bigger than they are today. So drummers could still make the same amount of noise, but they were going up against acoustic instruments. So drummers started looking around for stuff that was out there that they could use to play more quietly. And one of the things they came up with were these fly swatters. So you have to remember, this is the age before plastic. So when we think of a fly swatter today, we think about, plastic spatula looking thing, but fly swatters in this day actually were metal bristles like this. And they actually created some that were of the telescoping variety, so you'd preserve your little bristle. And a drummer picked this up one day and said, man, I could play, my little rudimental stuff that I've been doing, my ragtime drumming, my early jazz drumming, but use these fly swatters. And so thus begins brushes. And once they became more popular with drummers, well, then some of the companies that were manufacturing drum stuff said, well, hey, we'll actually start manufacturing these, and lo and behold, the name went from fly swatters to brushes. But for many, many years, drummers continued to refer to their brushes as fly swatters. When drummers first started using brushes back in the 1920s, they didn't use them the way we did today. They really used them as a quieter alternative to sticks. So, whereas you had your sort of rudimental sound, they would kind of imitate that with the brushes, kind of like this. Right? As we move into the 1920s and into the 1930s, they discovered that there was a lot of neat effects that you could get with the brushes. And part of it was about imitating dancers or imitating sandpaper, coming up with sort of different ways to use them. So then they started to add more effects where they would drag the brush across the head, for example. Right? So we get into that kind of a vibe. And of course, by the time we get into the 1930s, which we'll be talking about a couple more segments down the road, they really start integrating the brushes, and the brushes really take on, instead of just being an imitation of the sticks, they really take on their own vibe, and it really becomes an art form, brush playing. So our next stop in the evolution of drum set and drum set playing is the year 1917. Now this was the year that a band from New Orleans called the Original Dixieland Jazz Band went up to New York City and made some recordings that became huge hits all over the country. And the style that they were playing was a style from New Orleans, and it sort of kicked off what we call jazz music. It was really the first jazz, official jazz recordings. So jazz, if you know your history at all, is a style that does indeed come from New Orleans. And there's a lot of bands in New Orleans at the time that were making this kind of music. And it was kind of cool because a lot of the things that we've talked about so far in our discussion of at various points along the way here in our journey are now coming together. So from a drumming perspective, you have guys like Baby Dodds and Zooty Singleton, Ray Baduke, a guy named Tony Sparbaro, who was the drummer in the original Dixieland Jazz Band. And what they're doing is taking this idea of marching, right, that we talked about, but now combining your bass drum and your snare drum and some of these, what were called traps from these different immigrant groups that were coming in, little cymbals, little tom-toms, woodblocks, cowbells. And they started bringing all that together with this rudimental style of playing and combining it with ragtime, which had been popular for a couple of decades now, which was more syncopated and more swinging. So now drumming really starts to move away from the rudimental thing and kind of turn into its own little thing, jazz drumming style. So that's all happening around this time period. Now our drum set has grown just a little bit to add some of these elements known as traps. And we can point some of them out. Certainly woodblock, which originated actually in China and Korea. Cowbell, which is used in a lot of cultures. This is a Turkish type of a cymbal. It's actually an old Zildjian cymbal, and the Zildjian family came to the States in the early 20th century. So they were one of those immigrant groups. So this is an early example of their cymbal. And we have a Chinese cymbal here, actually made in China. It's a newer one. It's not a vintage one, but this is, typical of what Chinese cymbals still look like today. China cymbals, they've got that inside-out garbage can look. So the early drum set players from New Orleans would incorporate all of these kind of elements into what they were playing. Now, how did they play? Well, they took a lot of those rudiments and they started swinging them. And maybe before you'd have a nice, clean, open roll, shagadagadap, would now become da-jizup, jizup. So it'd become more of a press roll, and that sort of was more swinging and, again, made people want to dance. So we still have our two-feel kind of military thing going on. We don't have any hi-hats yet or big toms or ride or crash cymbals, but we've got these smaller kind of noise-making effects, and drummers would start to play fills on these. They were called fill-ins. So here's a little demonstration of what New Orleans drumming might have sounded like back at the time. So far in this series, we've spanned quite a few decades now looking at all kinds of different stuff about the evolution of the drum set. We've looked at double drumming, marching drumming, ragtime music, traps, and early jazz, New Orleans jazz. So now we're moving forward to 1919, just on the cusp of the 1920s. And as most of you know, the 1920s are often known as the Roaring Twenties, right? So what was going on that gave them this name, and how does that relate to this music we're talking about and to the drums? Well, in 1919, the U.S. Congress passed a law called Prohibition, which meant that it prohibited people from manufacturing and transporting alcohol for drinking, because there was a lot of moralistic complaints that drinking was evil and let's get rid of this evil scourge on society. But usually what happens when you tell someone that they can't do something? The first thing they're going to do is run right out and do as much of that as they can, right? So all of a sudden, drinking becomes the cool thing to do. But because it's illegal, it kind of goes underground. And so the 1920s is called the Jazz Age or the Roaring '20s because everyone decided to go crazy and party it up. And because drinking was illegal, you had the rise in cities like Chicago, but many other cities, as well, of gangsters. You know, you hear of Al Capone and guys like that. And the reason they came to prominence and power is because they were manufacturing and bootlegging liquor illegally. And places where people would go to drink liquor were called speakeasies a lot of times. These were underground establishments. You had to have the password to get in. And when you'd go in, you could drink. And so what kind of music are you going to have at these places? Well, you're going to have jazz music, because jazz music was also underground, illegal. It had been, you know, created and put forward. It was an African-American style. And of course, we lived in a very segregated nation at that time. And again, it was not upstanding to enjoy African-American music. So if you went to one of these speakeasies in the 20s, you'd see African-American jazz being played. You'd drink illegal liquor. It was very exciting. And of course, great dancing, you know, and jazz was great music to dance to in this time period. And jazz is starting to evolve now. It's been around for maybe 10 years, and so the bands are getting a little more sophisticated. We're adding more horns, we're building bigger arrangements, and we start heading towards what was going to be called the big band. So check it out. Here's a little bit more about what 1920s Chicago-style jazz is all about. So in both the New Orleans demonstration that I did in the previous segment and the Chicago demonstration that you just saw, you might notice that the way that I'm playing the fills is a little different than how we play fills today, right? The way we play fills today, generally we come down the tom-toms, crash. So we crash on beat 1 at the beginning of the following phrase. But the way I was playing here, we crashed on beat 4. So I'd be playing along 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And this is the way that fills were played and ended back in this early period. In fact, drummers ended their fills on beat 4 all the way until we get into the 1950s, believe it or not. And the reason for this was that you know, you have to remember that drums were very loud, the rest of the band was soft and acoustic, and if a drummer crashed on beat 1, it was considered rude, as if you were stepping on the other instruments in the band. So that's why this sort of idea of crashing on beat 4 came from. And it also comes from a New Orleans syncopated idea, which so there was a stress on beat 4 there. So as a result of those two kind of combination of ideas, drummers always played their crashes on beat 4. In our last segment, we were talking about the 1920s, the Roaring '20s, and how jazz had kind of really evolved as more of a popular art form, but it was happening with the gangsters and the speakeasies and all that kind of thing. So that's in terms of drummers playing jazz music. But just like today, here in the 21st century, drummers have a lot of different things that they can do. You know, so a lot of us out here are what we call freelance drummers, and we maybe one day are playing a show, and the next day we're playing a concert, and the next day we're doing a theater thing, and the next day we're playing in a club, and the next day we're playing for dancers. So there's a lot of different things that you could do, and drummers back then had the same sort of roles. They would take on many different roles. So we haven't really talked too much about this, but one of the really most important roles of a drummer in the 1920s was as what they call a Foley artist today, meaning a sound effects person. And you have to remember, this was back at a time period when you didn't have, you know, you had radio at this point, but you didn't have TV, you certainly didn't have computers. And you had movies, but the movies were silent movies. The technology wasn't there yet to have a soundtrack go along with the movie. So when a movie would come to a theater, either they would have a piano player, or in some of the bigger cities, and as the 1920s progressed and things got more sophisticated, they would have an entire orchestra backing up a silent movie. And it fell to the drummer in the band, or drummers, sometimes there'd be several of them, to provide all the sound effects. So if there was a gunshot, if there was a plane flying overhead, if a baby was crying, if there was a cow mooing, or a bird chirping, or a train coming into the station, or horses galloping, or somebody shooting somebody, or somebody bending over and their pants ripping, well, the drummer was responsible for all of this. And this got to be pretty sophisticated. And you could see sheet music from the period, and there would be all kinds of cues for what instrument a drummer had to play. And so like today, drummers had to have pretty large setups in these theater circumstances. Or if it was a radio show, they were, somebody was listening, the drummer was providing all of this filler, this background sound effects to bring the radio production to life. So what you're about to see next is something that probably you're not going to see anywhere today. This is the one and only place to check this out. And it's a demonstration done by William F. Ludwig III, who is the grandson of the founder of the Ludwig Drum Company, the original William F. Ludwig. Now we already talked about in an earlier segment that William F. Ludwig and his brother were the ones that invented the bass drum pedal design that we still use today. And of course, we all know that they also created the Ludwig Drum Company. But prior to getting into that, William F. Ludwig was a champion rudimental drummer, and he toured all over the country and was one of the most important theater drummers in the Chicago area. So his grandson, William F. Ludwig III, has inherited all of his grandfather's traps and noisemakers, and he's going to do a demonstration for you right now of what it was like for a trap drummer, either in a silent movie or a stage show or a radio show back in the 1920s.
My grandfather and his brother, William F. Ludwig Sr. and Theobald Ludwig, started out the drum company by having an actual drum shop that they would do repairs and help people tune their drums and keep them operating properly. As time went on, people would come to them with certain needs and say, I need this sound, or I need this drum to do this, or this piece of equipment. And so they became inventors of sound effects, which we have here today. In those days, before sound, the drummers were behind the screen watching the movie and doing the various sound effects along with the movie to make it more entertaining for the audience. One of our items that we have is the gunshot sound effect. And this actually holds .22 caliber blank shells. And then you close this down, have it on the table, and strike it with a hammer or a drumstick or whatever you have handy. The train effect is really interesting because it's so simple but effective. And then they even added this on as a separate item. You could get it with or without the bell, which I thought was pretty interesting. But this has a series of door springs inside. This looks like it was some kind of a file of some sort that they just saw it and picked it up and said, let's try that. And it worked. And that's the way he did most everything. That just slides in there. And then you go, if you're starting, if the train is just starting out, let's say, and you can increase the volume, speed, to really give the true effect of a train departing. And they also had to build items that could be transported because these percussionists were going from theater to theater. It wasn't always the same theater. Different train whistle, a boat whistle. So in the movie script, we say the sheriff rode into town, and these are the horse's hoofs that create that sound effect. And also, we say that the sheriff, when he arrived in town, went by the blacksmith's shop where he was shoeing a horse. And then he goes by the schoolhouse and hears the bell tolling. Then also, as the script continues with the Clancy brothers getting off the train, when the train stops, a dog nervously barks in the distance. Might have been a little ill at the time, but nevertheless, it's a dog. And we also have another sound effect that I don't have with me that's a large version of this. It's about this big around, it's on the floor, and you pull the cloth up on that, and it's a lion roar. So it's the same concept, just a little deeper. This is just a hollow metal cylinder with a type of head on it, and you just slide a cloth over the string. Along those lines of the whistles, we also have the basic siren and duck call. Which has been around forever. But these are all the tools of the trade of the percussionist in the silent movie era. And this rather odd-looking item is a cuckoo clock. Which always comes in handy. And then, of course, the cricket sound.
So you may be asking yourself, when did movies with sound first start? Well, the first, what we call talkies, were released in about 1927. And although this was pretty cool, they put sound with film for the first time. By 1930, all movies pretty much were coming out had sound, and the silent movie era was pretty much over in a very short period of time. And the downside of that was that literally thousands, tens of thousands of drummers were put out of work overnight, drummers who had specialized in doing all these sound effects and Foley effects. And if you think about it, for those of us who remember back in the 1980s when drum machines first came in, you know, it's a very similar kind of a thing. Everybody was panicked. Oh, this is it. The drummers are done, you know, will be replaced by machines. That was kind of what was happening back around 1927. But as you can see, drummers didn't go away. And here we are in the 21st century. We're still around. We're still playing drums. We're still evolving with all the technological changes and musical changes that happen around us. So it's a good lesson to look back at your history and see that we've had to face these things before. New technology, what are we going to do? Boom, we go this way. So here we are. We're still here, baby. Next stop on our journey through the evolution of drumming and the drum set is 1929. Now this is a momentous year, not just for drumming, but for the whole world. And why? Because you have the fabled stock market crash of 1929 that plunged the world into a global depression, okay? And tough times for everybody. A lot of people lost their jobs, their homes, their farms. It was a really terrible time. One of the things that helped people to get through these rough years of the Depression was jazz music. And as we've talked about in some of the earlier segments, we mentioned that jazz, which had started as kind of a small group phenomenon in New Orleans, progressed in the 1920s. Really, the bands started to become larger and more sophisticated. And as we get into the 1930s, and we really head towards the mid-30s, jazz is now America's most popular form of music. It went from being a real underground thing associated with mobsters and speakeasies and, was African-American in origin, but now it's really being embraced throughout the country. And the bands have become big enough that in the 1930s, the big band emerges as the vehicle that delivers jazz. Okay? Now, a lot of times we think about jazz as, something that's more affiliated with maybe John Coltrane or Charlie Parker or Wynton Marsalis, something that's not dance music. But at this time, jazz was pop music. It was dance music. It was the thing that people would go out to dance to on a Friday night. So let's talk a little bit about the big bands and the role they served. Well, the big bands were there for people that were sort of you know, the whole world being very depressed at this time period, they made people feel good. It was a lot of musicians, 17, 18 musicians, pumping out this wall of sound and really made people happy, made people want to dance. So the other reason that the big band succeeded in the 1930s was with the popularity of radio. And of course, radio at this time was now commonplace enough that most homes could have a radio, or you could go to an establishment and listen to the radio. So, you know, every night, Saturday night, 9:15 to 9:30, you'd hear the Benny Goodman Orchestra play their radio program from some hotel in New York City, and you'd wait and you'd listen, you know. So starting in the mid-1930s, we really get what's now called the big band era, and this would dominate the American musical landscape for the next 10 years. If you notice, since the last segment, our kit has grown a little bit more. And here in the 1930s, some other elements were added. We still have some elements of the old kit with the bell and the block here. We still have your kick and snare, but now we've added some more stuff. We've got toms now, which we'll talk about when we talk about Gene Krupa. We also have still some very small cymbals. We don't have big crash cymbals yet, because if we had a huge crash, we'd knock out the other instruments. And then we have a Chinese cymbal over here, and maybe the Chinese cymbals of the period got a little bit bigger as well. The main instrument, though, that's different on this kit now is we have this guy right here, the hi-hat. Hi-hat makes its first appearance around 1930. And the hi-hat really became the primary timekeeper for drummers during the big band era. Because earlier one of the things they'd done when they were playing their, you know, New Orleans or Chicago fields, they would choke a cymbal. And so that was one way of keeping time versus playing a press roll or playing on the rims or playing on your woodblock. But this was really rather cumbersome because you had to use two hands, right? So they also had the idea, well, let's come up with a foot cymbal that can go against the bass drum. So they created something called a snowshoe cymbal, which was a little foot-operated cymbal that sat on the floor. And now you could do this. So you could create a chick for every boom that you had. Boom, chick, boom, chick, boom, chick. So finally, at the end of the 20s, they said, well, why don't we take these and put them all together? And they had some different, they had what were called hand sock cymbals that you were, like a little hi-hat that you held in your hand, and all these sort of different variations. But this is what they ended up coming up with. And the reason it's called a hi-hat is because you had another, the early version of this sat on the floor, and it was called a low boy. So the low boy gave way to the hi-hat. So now you could play the cymbal with your stick, and you could close it with your foot all at once. And this was a revelation, and it really became the primary timekeeper during the swing era. The other major change that you see in drum set playing during the big band era is the switch over from the two feel. Remember, at the very beginning of our series, we talked about how drum set playing was based on marching. So you had this very heavy boom, ch, boom, ch, boom, ch, boom, ch, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, right? So the kick was always 1, 3, 1, 3. So one of the big advancements in playing during the 1930s, during the swing era, was this gradual evolution to the idea of playing always 4 to the bar, dum, 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 on the bass drum. So now you get this hi-hat going, and you get this 4 to the bar bass drum, you get this very nice sound. Okay, so let's check out a little bit of the swing style playing right now. In our last segment, we focused on the big band and talked about how in the mid-1930s, the big band kind of rose to prominence as the most dominant kind of pop music sound in the country. And of course, drummers at that time were just starting to bring in the hi-hat. This was a new instrument for the 1930s and a new sound, a new way of playing the drum set. And we can't really talk about the big band era unless we talk about Gene Krupa. And maybe some of you out there have heard of Gene Krupa, but he's probably one of the most important names in drumming, period, that we could talk about out of anybody. Because without Gene Krupa, we really wouldn't have the drum stars of today that we do, and we may not have the drum soloing today that we normally have come to expect. And Gene Krupa really was the first true star of the drums. There had been drummers before him that had been well known or that were maybe had done some flashy kind of solo-y stuff. But Gene Krupa really was the guy that took the drummer from being the timekeeper in the back of the band and brought him forward so that he was as much a part of the band, or she I should say, as much a part of the band as anybody else, as every other instrument. And Krupa was he was a wild, flashy player, a lot of energy, his hair flying, you know, and he was very exciting to watch. But Krupa was important not just because he was a well-known drummer and helped out the role of the drummer. He was important for many different reasons. And prior to this time, if we go back to the early drum sets, the tom-toms they had really were still almost like ethnic Chinese instruments, which really was where the tom-tom comes from. And the heads were tacked on, the drums tended to be small, and you couldn't really tune it like you could tune a snare drum. One of the things that Krupa did when it comes to the drum set was that he went to his company that he endorsed, the Slingerland Drum Company, and he said, you know, now that I'm doing this stuff in the big bands and we're able to play out more, play a little louder as drummers, I want to be able to take the tom-toms that we have and be able to tune them separately. So the idea of a dual tension tom-tom was really brought out by Gene Krupa. And once he started to use it with his big mega hit, Sing, 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 of course, every other band followed suit. And pretty soon, every big band had to have a star drummer. So it's at this time period where guys like Chick Webb emerged, and he actually came a little bit before Gene Krupa, was an influence on Krupa. Of course, Buddy Rich emerges, playing with first the Harry James Band, then the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra, and of course Joe Jones, who was the first great drum star with Count Basie's band. And each one of these guys brought their own personality to the drum set and to this new kind of bigger, beefier, more solid drum set that allowed drummers to really step up and show off what they could do. As we mentioned, Gene Krupa was really responsible for bringing the modern tom-tom into the drum set and really using it a lot as kind of a feature instrument and playing a lot on it. So I'm going to play a little Gene Krupa style tom-tom feature for you guys right now to kind of give you an idea of what that was all about.